Hey guys, today's video is going to be covering the Queen C2 variation of the Nimzo-Indian defense, which rises from the move order D4, Knight F6, C4, E6, Knight C3, and Bishop B4. This is the Nimzo-Indian defense, followed by Queen C2. This is one of the most popular lines. The point is pretty simple. Queen C2 helps prepare E4, but it also prepares A3, after which the trade of this knight is possible, and there, whites are going to be able to recapture the queen without ruining their pawn structure. So this is a really good move. It's been really popular for a while now. It's one of the most popular lines for white, and it's very solid. There are going to be three main moves that we're going to be covering in this line. After we play castle, which is our main move. Now there's a couple other things you can do, but my goal in this series is to give you guys the most practical move, the one that I would play. Not necessarily give you every possible option, but rather one or two lines that I think are going to be the most viable and best lines for you to play. So in my opinion, the best move here is to castle. That has been backed by many great grandmasters who play this opening. And from here, white has a couple of options. They have a3, which is something that we just discussed. Same with e4. And finally, knight f3, which is sort of a waiting move that pretty much asks black as to what our plan is. Let's start with the move a3. Now, this is by far the most popular move. It's the most straightforward move, so let's get this over with. After a3, if we put our bishop on b4, no need to delay anything. We can't really move this bishop back, otherwise why did we bring it out in the first place? We have to take this knight. So we're going to get the recapture of the queen. If our opponent chooses to recapture the pawn, there's 0 point in playing queen c2 in the first place. This is just weird. So we're not going to cover that because nobody does that. Queen takes c3, and we're going to follow up with d5. For a while now, c5 has been a very popular move, but recently d5 has integrated itself into modern chess theory. d5 is super strong. After d5, if this capture occurs, this very simply helps us develop the c8 bishop. It's a lot better than capturing with our knight, of course. If we were to capture with our knight, this queen could simply move anywhere and then follow it up with e4, and black would just be worse because this knight would have to go back, and this position would be very uncomfortable. So instead, we recapture with this pawn. The pawn is very much happy to be here. It's not an isolated pawn. We always have opportunities to play something like c6. Most of the time, we're going to play c5, but c6 is fine as well. But really, this helps us develop the c8 bishop, and this is why this is not a good line for white. This is very much playable for black, and this position is something that I would be very happy with. Now, after d5, if our opponent chooses to not trade and, let's say, develop like a normal person with knight f3, we're actually going to take this pawn. And this is one of the main reasons as to why we play d5, and it's to take this pawn. Because after the queen takes, we can play b6, and we're going to follow up with bishop a6. This is what has been played for a very long time, as modern chess theory has developed. And recently, there have been people who have been playing bishop b7, the goal of this is after bishop g5, bishop b7 is possible. This prevents e4 and it applies additional pressure on this knight f3 knight. The whole purpose of me saying this is that this is a really good option as well. If you want to play the Nimzo-Indian in this way, you absolutely can. However, I just see more purpose in bishop a6. And we can always bring this bishop back to b7 later if we wish to do so. From here, the theory sort of ends. White has like 4 different queen moves. But let's talk about the most kind of annoying one, which happens to be queen a4. Queen a4 applies additional pressure on this bishop, so we cannot develop our knight. Anything like queen c2 would allow an instant c5 and then the easy development of this knight to d7, which would further allow us to move our queen wherever we'd like to move it, given the fact that we would no longer need to defend this knight from being captured, simply because we could recapture with our own knight and not ruin our pawn structure. So queen c2 allows for instant c5, very easy game. Queen a4, not so much. We can still play c5 whenever we'd like to, but knight d7 isn't possible because we would blunder our bishop. So instead we're going to play h6, figure out if this bishop wants to trade. Most likely it's going to go back. If not, if this bishop decides to capture our knight, we're going to recapture the queen, and the game kind of goes on from there. There's no real theory at this point. You just have to play normally. Here you have c5 ideas, rook d8, should be fine. You can always attack this b2 pawn, so you're never really going to be in much trouble at this point. You're just going to play normally, like this is a normal middle game. Nothing to worry about. If this bishop does go back, though, this is a little bit annoying, presents some sort of challenge. You're going to follow up with c5. In these sort of positions with b6 and developing our bishop to a6, c5 is one of our main moves. It's something that we're going to play in most of the positions that we encounter. So make sure you familiarize yourself with this idea, and you should be fine. If this capture occurs, you can recapture back. And from here, like I said, this is kind of the final point. Your opponent might go for something like rook c1, in which case queen e7 is possible, or even queen b6 if you're fine with the idea of technically ruining your kingside pawn structure, making your king more exposed. Even though that is very difficult for white to exploit, that is still a weakness in your position. It makes your king safety a lot weaker. So you gotta find different things. You're gonna make concessions either way. and it's up to you to decide. Both of these options are completely fine if you were to face rook c1. Both queen e7 and queen b6 are very much good and pretty much equal for both sides. So that's that. Now let's take a look at some other options besides bishop g5. Your opponent might play a plethora of different moves. There's options like g3 and e3, and in those moves you can still play bishop a6. If you were to face e3, bishop a6 is perfect. Your opponent's going to move the queen somewhere. Let's say bishop a4. You can trade this bishop off. This prevents your opponent from castling, making, once again, king safety a big weakness for white. So that's good for you. Also allows for the easy development of this knight. You also don't run the risk of this knight being pinned because there's a pawn on e3. So this is a very fine position. You could also start with c5 or just knight d7, and this is very good. Now, in the case of g3, I apologize. In the case of g3, you don't have to do that much. You can just play bishop b7. That is fine as well. Or bishop a6, and no matter where your opponent goes, queen a4, for example, you could actually just slide this bishop back to b7, and this is once again a very fine position. The main ideas in this sort of line is to play c5 and knight d7, rook c8, and just trade this central pawn off. You're trying to create a pawn break because this pawn mass is going to be very strong, and if you don't do anything about it, you're going to be losing. So c5 are kind of central idea in this sort of line, and from there you want to aim on doing principal things like controlling the c file. If you happen to make a, let's say c5, e3 gets played and you trade this pawn and somehow white gets an IQP, you're going to play this in the style of an isolated queen spawn, so you would try to blockade this pawn. That's kind of unlikely. Most of the time, you're just going to get a trade, in which case you're going to have very slight imbalances. This position is going to be very much equal, so you're going to be at no disadvantage at all. And from there, you're just going to have to make your own middle game ideas, respond to your opponent, and just create and cultivate your own plans. All right, that covers the main move a3. Not very complicated. Like I said, very equal positions. Those positions can be seen as a little bit dry, and they usually lead to draws, but there's still a lot of life in those positions if you're not playing against a super grandmaster, given the fact that both players are likely to make some sort of mistake, and the idea of pushing this pawn to c5 is likely going to create some imbalances in the position. So with that all being said, let's take a look at now the second move, e4. This is another very popular move. You're expanding in the center. This is one of the main reasons that queen c2 is such a good option, because it supports the advancement of this pawn. From here, we're going to play the very simple d5 once again. There's no point in deviating and memorizing 60 different moves of theory, because that's just not possible for a regular human being. It's not practical, it's not very useful. So we're just going to play very similar moves as to what we previously played, and that is not to say that this is in some way subpar to any other variation. This is just up to your personal choice. For example, even c5 here can be a viable option. The point I'm trying to make is that it's better to stick with something that we're familiar with, and from there expand our knowledge on that. d5 is a very, very fashionable move. It's very trendy right now, and it's a very good move. e5, main line. Once again, you're not going to face these trades, because if they are to occur, you're going to be simply very much better. The c8 bishop is now very easy to develop, and that just gives you a small advantage. And after all these trades, now it's impossible for white to recapture the queen. So if you get something like a3, trade this knight off, and now you got these kind of hanging pawn structure, which you can exploit, and you can treat this pawn as an isolated queen spawn, so you can work on blockading it and applying as much pressure as you want on it. So instead of capturing these pawns, it's most likely that your opponent is going to play e5 and expand in the center. We're going to jump our knight into e4, applying pressure on this knight, and the lines get very complicated here because of the sheer amount of kind of options your opponent might have. But I'm going to try to break each one down so you guys have an easier and better understanding of this position. So, main move, bishop d3. It makes a lot of sense that you want to get rid of this knight. Now, it's important to recognize that the trading of this knight isn't a viable option, because if you were to do so, this pawn is going to recapture back. You're going to have to slide your bishop somewhere, and then you're going to end up losing the pawn to a very annoying bishop check, given that there's this battery. And that's just going to land you in a very bad position. So we're never going to take this knight. That's one trade that we can already just mentally eliminate. We know that we're not going to do it. Now, next up, we can also eliminate that we're not going to capture this pawn, because we're going to end up losing this knight. So that simplifies the position enough for us that we can start looking for other moves. And the move that we're going to play in this particular position is the move c5. Striking in the center, once again, this pawn is very strong, this sort of pawn center, and we want to break it apart using pawn breaks. So in any d4 opening, you're going to see the move c5 played very often, because it's one of the more prominent pawn breaks that you can make in d4 openings. Your opponent here has a multitude of options. Most likely they're going to play something like knight f3, or they can even, I don't know, trade this pawn, for example, in which case you're going to recapture back, let's say knight e2, and the position is very equal from here. You can always take this pawn. Now in this position, the best move that you can play is knight to d7. The point is that you're not worried about this knight trade happening, because if you think you're losing a pawn, that's not really the case. You can capture this pawn on e5, and if the queen chooses to capture back, rook e8 pins the queen to the king, and you end up winning a queen. So you're going to simply win the game. Instead of that, you're going to recapture this pawn. I'd say black has a small advantage in the fact that it's very much easier to play. Our king is already castled. We have this very nice pin, which we can use to disrupt this pawn structure and just make an awkward pawn on c3. Our knight here in the center is very strong. You can go to c4, for example. Rook e8 is a very strong possibility in the upcoming couple of moves. And so we just have very, very easy intuitive development. We don't have to think too much about creating moves. Whereas our opponent has to tread carefully because it's very easy to blunder something in this position. Now let's move on to another line. Let's say after c5, instead of the capture of this pawn, we get something like knight f3, which is another viable option. We're going to capture the d4 pawn here as well. Knight takes, 97. So a very similar line. Not too much to think about. Just memorize that 97 is strong, and you're not worried about the capture of this knight. If the capture of your knight occurred here, you could simply play queen c7 and be completely on your way to recapturing this pawn. Bishop f4 is not possible because you're able to capture this pawn on c4, since this is a fork of pawns, and you're just going to be well on your way to winning this game. Now, if your opponent chooses to play bishop f4 earlier prior to capturing your knight, you're going to have this very, very weird line where you can put your queen on h4, force g3, which is a very much weakening move. This weakens the light squares around white's king if white was to choose to castle kingside. If black chooses to castle queenside, that's going to be a very interesting game. Opposite side castling always leads to very aggressive games. Now we're going to prevent that by playing queen h5. This prevents the opponent from castling. And here there's like a plethora of options, but most of the time you're going to just get kingside castling. You can follow with g5, super aggressive move, just starting an attack. And from there, there's a ton of different things that your opponent might do. This is the kind of line you might expect. If you were to play this opening, you can take this pawn and just expect chaos. Now you can also avoid all of that chaos if you'd like to by playing knight to c5, knight dc5 to be exact. And this is a very, very fine position. This is considered equal. So I'm presenting you guys a choice between playing a very normal kind of line with knight d to c5, solidifying these knights into this game, or choosing to play this super aggressive queen h4 line, which leads to a bunch of imbalances, a bunch of chaos, which can be super fun and interesting, but very difficult to calculate. That covers everything to do with e4. Now, let's take a look at the move knight f3. So knight f3 is a waiting move, basically asking black what our plan is. We're going to respond calmly with d5, which is a move that we're going to play in any other variation of the queen c2 line, as we've just discussed. Your opponent has a plethora of options here. Most of the time, they're going to trade the pawn. If your opponent goes for something like bishop g5, you can just follow up with h6, trade, and you're going to be completely fine. Now, if your opponent backs away to h4, develop normally. This is a completely equal position. I'd say this is better for black than it is for white. You can follow up with c5, something that we've discussed very recently. And if your opponent chooses to take this pawn on c5, generally it's advised not to recapture this bishop because the spin is worth far more than the immediate capture of this pawn. This pawn isn't going anywhere, and so you can follow with knight d7 and prepare to capture this pawn. A very, very fine move. This pawn, like I said, it isn't going anywhere, and so you don't have to worry about the opponent reinforcing it somehow. You're just going to be able to recapture the pawn and maintain this additional pressure on the king. Now, if your opponent chooses to capture this pawn, you're going to recapture it with a d pawn. This is a very odd choice of moves for white, because this allows the easy development of our light square bishop, which is our main weakness in the Nimzo-Indian, is the difficulties revolving around the development of this light square bishop. And so if we're able to do that, we're pretty much left with no problems. Our king is safe, our pieces are all very well developed, and soon enough, so will this bishop be. Bishop g5 here, once again runs into h6, bishop h4, and c5. So c5, prominent idea. The capture of this pawn can lead to knight d7 once again. There isn't that much theory or moves that you can run into, simply because this isn't a very popular option, but the people who play usually use it as a surprise weapon, or they just aren't very familiar with the position. So this is something you might run into, and in this case, you should just familiarize yourself with the middle game plans of the Nimzo-Indian defense. In our case, we have an IQP, so we have the isolated queen pawn, which means that we should have worked really hard to push it and advance it. We have to place all of our pieces in accordance with advancing this pawn and creating very aggressive playstyles. We also generally want to avoid major trades simply because that's going to help white simplify into a position. And in most endgames, having an IQP isn't a very good thing since it poses itself as a weakness. Therefore, avoid trades, work on pushing the spawn, and you will be in a slightly better position every single time you play this opening. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this summarizes everything I wanted to show you for this Queen C2 variation of the Nimzo-Indian defense. I hope you guys found this video useful, and if you did, please consider checking out a video to my left. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in a future video.